Surprised when I come out and people are still here. So thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, there we go. There were a large number of good questions. Happily, there were a large number of questions that I was going to ask that I didn't have time, so that you were going to ask, which is nice. And so I'll try and do an order. We won't have time to get through all of them. I'm going to try and maybe do as much as a half an hour, but we want to get people home, and there's a book signing as well afterwards, and Peter's still on East Coast time, so we'll try and be considerate of everyone. The first question is actually one that segues nicely from where we finished off, and I was going to ask it, but there wasn't time. And one could ask the question: you've talked about that, people can say, well, it's okay to kill animals that really don't, intuit or view the future or worry, because they're not. It's just okay. They're not like humans. And you've argued, well, okay, then is it okay to kill mentally retarded people or infants, who are equally in that state? But of course, that begs the natural question, which Tanmay asks. In that sense, could you argue that abortion is unethical? And so I'd like you to deal with that.
Yeah, so I don't think, you've heard me argue that I don't think the fact that a being is human necessarily gives it rights that other beings don't have, if we want to talk about rights, or that its interests count more. So I think you have to look at beings for what they are. Beings that can feel pain, you have to take account of their pain. Beings that in some way have a sense of their own life as existing over time, I think maybe makes it more serious to end that life. So the fact that a fetus is a member of the species Homo sapien is not enough to say that it has a right to life. In my view, if it's not even conscious, and the fetus is probably not conscious at least for the first 20 weeks after conception, then I don't think that there is really a problem in ending its life. I think that should be entirely the choice of the pregnant woman. Once it's conscious, there's something else to take into account, which is not to say necessarily that something else outweighs the interests of the pregnant woman, but at least, then you're getting to the point where you could say you're harming the fetus, depending on perhaps, what happens to the fetus during the termination process. But the full right to life that we all in this room have, I think does depend on having still further capacities that no fetus ever develops. That only happen sometime after birth, in fact.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is a misunderstanding of the process of actual conception and when life, if you've had the opportunity to go, I've lectured in hospitals and seen in vitro fertilization facilities, and you realize there's no such thing as a moment of conception. There's no such thing as where there's life and non-life, and it's a continuum. And then, of course, the question is, if it's not viable but has the potential to be viable, people argue. And I would argue to that by saying, well, it's ridiculous to talk about potential because, eventually, to be blunt, eventually we will probably be able to take single sperm and turn them into viable human beings at some point. Medicine might be able to.
Well, we could probably take stem cells and turn them.
But if we could do that, then will we make masturbation illegal? Because and so I'm trying to be blunt, but at some point there's a real issue here, and it's a continuum. It's a complicated question, but certainly not. I think we both agree, not one with an obvious sacred answer. It's a complicated question that requires thinking carefully.
That's right, and it's not. You're right. It's not a question about when life begins. It's a question about when the developing entity has the capacities that
has
give
rights.
It a right.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We've been taking lots of questions from Twitter as well, and let me take one from Twitter. Where is the line between effective altruism and aestheticism?
And aestheticism?
Yeah.
Oh, asceticism. Right. Okay.
Not aestheticism.
Right. Okay.
Asceticism.
So look, it's firstly, as I've said, I don't think there's any point in telling people that they have to be saints and live in sackcloth. I know a lot of effective altruists, and there's a whole lot of different choices. So we talked about Matt Wager, who gives, as I said, a six-figure sum each year to charities. But that doesn't mean that he lives, doesn't spend anything on himself that he enjoys. He does, but he knows that he's giving so much more than practically anyone else is giving in society as a proportion of his income, that he's entitled to feel pretty comfortable about what he's doing. And there may be other people who decide that they want to give more. I do talk in my book, The Most Good You Can Do, about somebody called Ian Ross, who gives 95% of what he earns, and he's not earning like Bill Gates or in the millions. He's earning pretty well, but he's actually still living a very modest life, so that he can give more. So I think that's, perhaps you could say, even more laudable, but I certainly don't think that that's what you need to do. I think you said, I'm arguing that you ought to make a significant part of your life directed towards effective altruism, towards making the world a better place. But, that's vague because people have different needs, different demands. Another way of putting it, my friend Charlie Bressler, who you had The Life You Can Save up on the screen during the intermission, he's the unpaid executive director of The Life You Can Save. In fact, I say he's paid negatively because he donates to it as well and gets no salary. So his view is, and he has a PhD in psychology, his view is just do your best, right? Just like when you go running, maybe, you have a time and then you try and beat that time next time you run. So give what you're comfortable with this year. Next year, maybe you can do better. I think that's a good way of approaching it.
Okay, here's another one. Does the concept of altruism stand up when it is considered that individuals commit acts of kindness to feel good? Do you think one would donate blood if they were not gratified in doing so? So is there anything wrong with feeling good?
I think there's nothing at all wrong with feeling good because you're helping others. I don't think that detracts from the altruism. It's because you're helping others that you feel good. It's not because you are rewarded in some more instrumental way, right? It's not like if somebody saved a drowning child and then when you ask why did they do it, they said because I knew the child's father was very rich and was going to give me a big reward. You might say, well, that's not altruism, right? But these are people who their aim is to help others, and incidentally, they feel good, and there's a lot of psychological research that shows that people who are generous and help others are more satisfied with their lives. They are happier. But I think they're still altruists.
And okay, and that allows me to segue to the next question, which follows from it in an interesting way. If I can prove that I gain more pleasure from eating an animal than it gets from living its life, is it okay for me to eat an animal?
Somebody's been studying their utilitarianism. Look, I don't think that's, hypothetically, I guess, a utilitarian is going to have to say yes, but I don't think that's, what you have to consider is not the pleasure you get from eating it, but the extra pleasure that you get from eating this animal that you could not have got from eating a plant-based dinner. And once you've, become a creative cook with plant-based meals, I don't think there's any diminution of your pleasure. So I don't really think it's at all probable that you're going to get that.
Okay, hunting enthusiasts often argue that the fees generated from safaris support conservation efforts and that safaris are thus ethically justified. Assuming the argument is factually accurate and it does financially support conservation, is the argument ethically viable? And is there an ethical distinction between consumption of an animal for food and trophy hunting?
Yeah, so this is becoming a big debate because particularly in some parts of Africa where we have species that are really severely endangered, rhino, for example, it does seem that unless there's value to the local community in the survival of those animals, unless in some way there is money coming into the region through that, the animals are not going to be there anymore. They will because they do have alternative ways of making money from these animals. Rhino horn is very valuable. So either they will become poachers or the poachers will bribe them and the animals will disappear. So if that is the situation, if the argument, as the question asks, is factually correct, and that is really the only feasible way we have of saving those animals, I'm very reluctantly going to say, yes, that's what you ought to do.
Okay, speaking of that, someone asked about the elephant in the room, a different kind of, but it raised a question I was actually we've talked about and I was going to bring up, because I really think it's at the heart of a lot of these problems, but it's discussed, and it's not discussed, and it is the elephant in the room, and that's overpopulation. A lot of the problem that exacerbates many of the issues you talk about, from poverty to the necessity for food factories, or the apparent necessity for factory foods, is population. And isn't it, I mean, I'm going to change this question a little bit, because this person asks, aren't charities the problem because they exacerbate the problem of population? But you can ask that one too, but I'm going to also address it and say, isn't it unethical for people to have, in the current world, for people to have more children than meets that raises the population?
Well, look, there's a number of things to say here. Firstly, if we're concerned about the environmental pressures on the world, and particularly climate change is the greatest one, then we are not really in a position to say to impoverished people in developing countries, you should only have 2 children, because our 2 children are producing, it will depend on which country, producing maybe 10 times, in some cases maybe 20 or 30 times as many greenhouse gases as each of those children of an impoverished person in a developing country. So, the responsibility is on us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as much or more as it is on them to reduce their population. Having said that, it is true that there are some countries where population is growing at an alarming rate. They're often the countries where people are least educated, particularly where girls are least educated, and often countries where there is little access to contraception. So there is an obvious answer there, and it's an answer to the question about aren't charities making this worse? If this is your concern, and it's a legitimate concern, direct your donations to charities like Population Services International, which is providing contraception in places where people can't get it, and there are other organizations doing that as well, or to charities which are educating girls. Because there's a strong correlation between the number of years of schooling a girl has, I should say a strong inverse correlation, and the number of children that she has.
That's vitally important. I mean,
it is an important fact.
I wrote a piece saying, educate women, save the world, but I think there's every bit of evidence, not just in terms of reducing population, that educated women have fewer children, but are more likely to have an economics that benefits the family if they're educated.
Absolutely, and their children are more likely to survive because they're better spaced. Yeah.
But the question of population really does, you would agree, hit in some way many of the issues that we've talked about.
Ultimately, except
and
you didn't mention factory farming, and I don't think it does, because factory farming is because of the demand for animal protein, and it's a waste of food, right? The conversion ratio is the amount of food value we put into these animals, which is grain or soybeans or in some cases fish meal, as compared to the amount of food value we get out of it, is sometimes as little as 1 in 10. So in other words, 10 units of food value go into beef cattle in a feedlot in the form of grain, and we get 1 unit out. So it's a food factory in reverse.
Well, yeah, but you do state in the book, and one could say, I mean, we're way past this maybe, but that, the idyllic farm, you could imagine farms with free-range cattle and chickens and living a nice life, and then you might imagine but that's just not practical to do in the current world. And one of the reasons is that we've way past the population where you can imagine doing that.
We would have to dramatically, if we eliminate factory farming, we would certainly have to dramatically reduce our consumption of animals. But there's independent reasons for thinking we should do that.
But to come back to the question once again, is it unethical?
Is it unethical to have more than 2 children?
Yeah.
I think that it is going to depend on people's circumstances. I'm not going to say absolutely that it is, but I do think that to have really, significantly larger families is definitely an ethical problem.
And I of course agree that, I don't think, I'm not in favor of forcing people to do things. I'm in favor of convincing them. And one of the ways, for example, is taxation. So what do you think of the argument? I've always thought that giving money to support more children, we should tax people. It's just like buying luxury quantities. So if you want to have another child, you pay higher taxes.
Well, you could pay an additional surcharge on your tax so that people with more income would pay more of it, and people with less would pay less. That's possible.
In any case, I don't want to labor it, but a lot of people are interested in pets. There were a lot of questions on that, and so here are two that sort of we can cover. One is, can it be ethical to own pets, considering that dogs and cats, especially, may need to consume meat to be healthy?
Yeah, I think once you have these animals, I think obviously, you ought to look after them and keep them going. But I do think that there's a problem. It's particularly cats who really, it's very difficult to raise as vegetarians. Dogs are not that difficult, plenty of people who do. But cats are a problem.
Well, that's because you're Australian. I was in Australia, and for some reason they don't like cats in Australia. But
well, the other thing is that with cats you have this horrible choice. Either you keep them inside, which generally they don't like, or you let them outside, in which case they're killers. Cats are predators.
They are killers, but they certainly don't. I think the arguments that they dramatically change the population, I've seen no real evidence that cats really dramatically reduce the population even in Australia.
I think that's wrong. I think they clearly do. Particularly where they're kept in areas adjoining native forest and bush. They clearly kill small marsupials and small birds.
Well, they kill some.
No, they kill, where you're talking about a suburb,
okay,
a suburb with a significant population.
That's something we'll have to compare later. The facts will eventually come up in that regard, but it's an interesting question. No, I don't know. I suspect I disagree, but I don't know enough to be able to.
I think there are some good studies now of cat predation.
Speaking of this, is the domestic...
significant.
Okay.
Sorry, cat owners.
Is it unfair to? My wife happens to love cats, so I'm going to say, but their evolution has made them beautiful killers. Is it really unfair not to let evolution work so effectively? It seems to me. Anyway, is the domestication of animals inherently unethical because it is unnecessary? And how about the domestication of land?
The domestication of land.
Land, yeah.
Well, I'm not quite sure if that means
farming
land to grow food. I think that is necessary, certainly necessary now, and I don't think that, we wanted to say that we should have stayed with a hunting and gathering lifestyle. I don't think that is necessarily better. I know there are people who think that the move to agriculture was a big mistake, but there would be far fewer people in the world without that, and then we have to get into questions of value about, is it a good thing that there are lots of people, maybe there's too many people, but that there are lots of people who are able to enjoy a rich and fulfilling life. I think that is a good thing.
Okay, let's switch tax a little bit. Okay, for a second, and then I want to come back to food again because there's another good question there. But if my autonomy and desire is worthy of using the Death with Dignity Act when I'm terminally ill, why does my autonomy not permit me the same freedom to choose death even if absent of terminal illness? That's the person who asked the question. So I think it's a very important question.
Look, it is a good question, and clearly if your argument is solely based on autonomy or perhaps on dignity, then that conclusion does follow. If you think that the legislation ought to be limited to people who are terminally or incurably ill, there's an element of paternalism in that. There's an element of saying we don't want people to make judgments which might be mistaken, where some people might sometimes think of ending their lives and then they're talked out of it, and they might then a few years later say, I'm so happy that I was talked out of it. So it's that balance between freedom and a degree of paternalism which I think can be defended, but both arguments are possible.
Okay, let's see. Well, we're going to go back to some food questions in a second, but here's another ethical question related to health. What ethical responsibility does the medical profession have to administer pain medications to an Alzheimer's patient whose spouse, who by default has medical care power, refuses to allow pain medications to be given? So
So this is a
Alzheimer's
patient who
has
is
given
in
up,
pain?
Yeah, who's in pain, whose spouse has given, of course, the authorization to be able to administer.
Yeah.
And is the medical profession unethical by not administering pain medication in that case?
Look, I think the medical profession ought normally to follow. If somebody has authorized you, I would certainly want, if I'd authorized my spouse to give directions for my care if I should be incompetent, I would want the medical profession to follow her instructions. Of course, I am confident that if I were in pain, she would want pain medication to be given. And, probably there would be a time when she would want me to be given large doses so I'm not there anymore, because that's what I would like. And I know that she would follow that.
But you've trusted it, but you're no longer in a position to trust it. Maybe she thinks about all the awful things you did to her. And
we won't go there tonight.
And then, no, but I mean, so she does something that other people may be good.
Then I don't think it's up to the medical profession to ignore a proper request that grants decision-making power to somebody else. They would have to go to a court and make the case that this is not in the interest of the person, and maybe the court could then overturn it.
Okay. Here's a question I know a lot of people ask is it ethical to eat humanely raised, free-range, grass-fed, etc. meat from Whole Foods Market?
Look, it's definitely more ethical than eating factory-farmed meat, obviously. I noticed the grass-fed, which probably meant that they were really talking about beef. And the problem with grass-fed beef is not so much that the animals have miserable lives. If they are out on the range their entire lives with a social group, it's probably quite a good life. But it is the methane problem, I think, with beef cattle. There's no way around that at present. So I think we should be avoiding beef for the sake of the planet.
Well, here's a related question. What's the difference, if any, between hunting and shooting a pheasant or deer for food as compared to chickens or cattle? Haven't the pheasant and deer really led quite happy and fulfilling lives? And does overpopulation of deer alter this view?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, this may not be a popular view among people concerned about animals, but I do think that if you're going to eat meat, it's, let's say I'm familiar with the situation in New Jersey where Princeton is, I don't know much about here. So definitely there is a population issue with deer. The predators have gone, whether they were wolves or Native Americans, they're not there. And I think that somebody who is a good shot and goes out and can put a bullet through the head of a deer and drop it instantly is more ethical than somebody who goes down to a supermarket and buys factory-farmed pork or chicken or something of that sort. Yeah.
Could you do it?
I couldn't. I don't think I could do it. I don't think I'd be a good enough shot anyway. But I probably couldn't do it anyway. I wouldn't. I remember I was taken fishing when I was quite young, and I just didn't like the idea of you'd haul the fish out and then just, obviously better to kill it with a knife. I was given a knife and told to kill it. Obviously better to do that than to leave it to suffocate. Yeah. It's quicker death. But yeah, I found it very hard.
I used to fish a lot, and then I finally realized that killing it directly is more ethical, and it became much more distasteful. And I was surprised to read in your book, actually. When I was a kid, I refused to dissect animals in my science class because I said, they've got pictures of them in the book, and this frog doesn't need me to look inside that frog. I can look at the book. But apparently that's an issue now in some school districts, right, where they're not requiring kids to dissect animals.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's completely unnecessary. And there are other ways of learning what animals look like inside nowadays.
Google, yeah. Okay, the last two questions are important because they have, part of them is to me. But it's relevant. So one is to me, which says, what would it take to convince you to become a vegan? It's an interesting question. We've talked about it. I can see the case to be a vegetarian much more strongly than a vegan, in the sense that I can imagine I usually use free range. If I eat eggs, it's usually free range. It's always free range chickens, and it seems to me as an ethical question of lifestyle that considering that doesn't seem that unethical, and or at least the convenience that I have versus the potential suffering is not greatly there. But I think the biggest thing that will convince me to be a vegan is to learn how to cook. I think, honestly, to tell you the truth, that to me, if I'm really honest, which every now and then I try to be, is to learn how to take care to make interesting recipes. Requires creativity, intelligence, knowledge, and time, and the time is the thing that I don't seem to have.
Yeah, but I mean, it is actually a creative activity. You know, I certainly really started getting serious about cooking when I became a vegetarian, because I wanted then to explore these other cuisines where meat is not so central, Asian cuisines in particular. And it's a lot of fun, and it doesn't necessarily take a long time. Some dishes take a while, but it is a lot of fun, and it's a creative activity. So I think, you know, we all have to do some things that are a bit different and relaxing. Can't sit at our computers all day long.
But there are also some things, as you said, when we talk about the shoes here, that are easy to do. And so I think, you know, those. I drink soy milk, for example, because it's easy and it's fine, and it's a simple way. It doesn't. There's no cost to me from a convenience point of view, and it does, I think, address an issue at least.
Absolutely,
so it's an easy. So I take the easy route.
Yeah, well, you know, things are getting easy. That's the other thing. We're getting more and more substitutes. You know, we're getting just mayo, which is a plant-based mayonnaise rather than the egg stuff. We're getting, you know, vegan cheeses used to be horrible. They used to be like eating plastic or rubber. They're actually getting pretty good now. Yeah. So I think we're starting to get good substitutes, and it'll get easier and easier.
Okay, the last question is a two-part question. First to you, is it ethical for me to kill the ants in my house? How about termites? How about ants in my yard?
Yeah. So I don't think we really know whether ants or other insects are conscious beings. I mean, they may be. We just don't really quite understand. In some ways, their behavior is more robotic. It's less flexible than the behavior of vertebrates, for example. But we don't know. So I would say, if you can give them the benefit of the doubt, do. But you know, sometimes it's very hard to live with ants. You know, to keep them out of your house without doing something lethal to them. And that may be true of termites, which, depending on the nature of your house construction, might be eating the timber in your house or digging up your back. Yeah, I mean, I think there are cases where it's legitimate to say, we don't really know what their interests are, we do know what our interests are, and we're entitled to give preference to serious interests of ours over theirs.
If you see a spider on the ceiling above your bed before you go to sleep, a big, hairy spider like you see in Australia, what do you do?
You know, I know, it happens quite often. I know that these big hairy spiders.
I know it's happened to me in Australia.
It's called a huntsman. It's completely harmless. It will catch flies around the house.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave it there.
What about the little ones?
The little ones. You know, we have a couple of poisonous spiders in Australia, but they don't usually get in your house. They're more likely to be
I've seen them in our house there. Anyway.
I'll put them out.
Okay. And the last part of this question is to me, and I want to end with it, is the question, are those asses on your shirt? And I know it's a question that many of you have had, and I want to clarify this. These are zebras, and we don't have, I don't know if we have the,
oh yes,
yeah, but they're zebras. So although it would have been maybe appropriate for me to wear the asses, they aren't. So with that, I want to thank all of you. Before I thank Peter, one of the joys of running the Origins Project, besides bringing people like Peter and having these discussions, is the audiences. And almost the universal feedback I get from people who come to our events, besides being amazed that this many people will come to an event, is the quality of the audience. And it is truly remarkable. So I really appreciate, and we all do, not only just your attendance, but the interest and the quality of the questions. And I know I'm always impressed. So give yourself a round of applause. Thank you. This has been a joy for me to have you, Peter, and I want to thank Peter for coming and sharing and becoming a part of the Origins Project.
Thanks very much, Krauss. Thanks for having me. You know, great discussion. Thanks to all of you.
And I'll let you get your applause here, but let me say two things. No, I can't let them make them stop, but let me say two things. First, Peter will be, as I guess I will be, signing books afterwards. But the good thing is that, as I said earlier today, Peter's actually one of us because Peter's an Origins Distinguished Visiting Professor, and that means he'll be returning back to us. One of the great joys of the Origins Project is we can bring in the best minds in the world here. We have two more Nobel laureates here coming to spend time with us. And we'll have many more events, and you should look at the rest of our program. Some of you can come to Antarctica with us in December. In January, we'll be having an event on the 100th anniversary of general relativity, a wonderful, great debate in March on creativity and madness in humans and machines. So as long as you keep coming,